And again, thank you everyone for your time. I appreciate it.
Alright. So I'm gonna start with a little bit more assembly, just to show, like Nan mentioned earlier, there are primer can actually be an integral part of assembly. So something that you don't see a lot in the miniature hobby, but you'll see a ton in the model kit community, is you assemble your model, clean it up and everything, and then you prime to check and make sure that it's clean, and if it's not, then you sand it and you reprime. So that's something that I just want to show real quick and talk about a couple other small products. They're good. So just like Nan did, I'm just gonna quickly clean this model up real quick. Just scraping with the back of the blade, getting all the mold lines that I can.
I'll be right back, good.
Yep. And it's very important when painting miniatures or anything really to get it good and cleaned up, because again, like Nan said earlier, if you have mold lines showing and stuff like that, people will notice. Especially when you take pictures. If you're taking your pictures up close, then something a lot of people experience is they think their model is all cleaned up and nice, and then they go to prime and they go to take pictures and they get their pictures and it turns out, oh, look, you can see mold lines. So it's really important to make sure that you clean things up really well. This is, to me, a sanding sponge I mentioned earlier. This stuff is really, really useful. Like I said, it's basically just abrasive backing on sponge. And the reason that I like this so much is, as I said earlier, it conforms to the surface more when you're sanding. So you won't really get flat spots when you use it. It'll conform to the surface and round over as you need it to. So that's really useful to use. So I'm going to be airbrushing the primer on. Some of the things that I'm going to talk about here are applicable to spray can priming as well. But in terms of primer that I would suggest, for brush on or airbrush primer, this is what I would suggest. A little hard to read, but it's Badger Stenorez. It's spelled very funny, but it's in my opinion, the best acrylic primer you can get. If you're in Europe, Nan, do you remember what the brand is called over there? I think
Ultimate Primer,
yeah,
or
Ultimate
MIG
Primer.
One Shot.
Yeah. Those are basically the same as Stenorez, and you can brush this on or you can airbrush it. So if you're a brush primer or an airbrush primer, Stenorez is really good. If you're using spray cans, I don't have a lot of recommendations. I don't know about you, Nan, but Rust-Oleum is the only one I have any experience with, and it worked fine for me. So
yeah, the Rust-Oleum 2X flat specifically. For America, I've heard people in the UK use the Halford's primer. Basically, if you're using a rattle can, you just want to check and make sure that it's for plastic, right?
yeah.
You don't want to be using automotive primer. A lot of that stuff is a lot more heavy duty, self-etching, goes on a lot more thick. You just want to use a lightweight plastic or for plastic primer is what you're really looking. Don't buy Army Painter cans. They have a propensity for exploding, so I would shy away from those.
MIG is the company. I think Ammo by MIG is just a different thing, or a line under the same company or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, MIG One Shot is the primer. So,
Yep.
real quick, holding the miniature. How are you going to hold it to paint it? Obviously you can't do that. So something that people use commonly is this, which is poster tack. You can kind of knead it a little bit, get it warm and sticky, and then put it on the bottom, and then attach it to your plinth, and that'll hold it. I don't really like that personally, but it works for a lot of people. What I use is this. It's double-sided tape. It's basically a kind of thick, spongy, double-sided tape, and it's very strong, so you can attach it to a base, cut a little piece off, and then struggle to peel the backing off because it's always difficult for some reason. I use tweezers to do that. And then once you have the backing off, you can just stick your base on, and it will hold pretty good. Chowka's asking, exploding over your miniature or literally exploding for the army painter?
There's a lot of documentation online of these cans, the can itself rupturing. Not always to fully to the point where the accelerant and paint's coming out, but if you see the pictures and you know about the amount of pressure that's in a can of spray paint, it should send off some warning bells that this stuff's not really seeing a whole lot of scrutiny in terms of quality control. And I've seen enough of these in the past year that I would definitely not recommend Army Painter Primer. Plus, at the end of the day, it's like $16 for a can of primer. A can of Rust-Oleum 2X flat is $4, so, you know, again with the branding thing.
Okay, so for priming, like I said, I'm just going to use an airbrush. I can brush prime on the back, so I'll show airbrush priming real quick. And what I'm going to do here is pretty applicable to spray can priming as well. With a spray can, you want to hold your miniature reasonably far away, 6 to 8 inches or so, and you basically start spraying off of the model, and then you sweep across the model with your primer can. That way, because if you just aim directly at it and you just spray, you can get way too much on the model, and you don't want to do that. You want to kind of spritz it on and layer it, and not just go too ham right away when you're using a spray can. So always spray off of the model and then sweep across several times to get it good and saturated.
And end off the model at the end as well.
Right. When airbrush priming, you don't. It's a good practice to do that, but you can also kind of just spray at the model and saturate the model in primer, and then let that dry. So then let's do some quick brush priming. So for brush priming, you're usually going to want to use the primer as is, don't thin it at all. One of the reasons you're doing that is when you're applying paint on a bare plastic model, or a bare resin model, or a bare metal model, any kind of material basically, you need the primer to not be too watered down, because if there's water in it, then the primer will beat up on the surface and you won't get good coverage. So you want to use the primer straight out of the bottle typically. One thing about primers, I would avoid using Vallejo primer. It's not sandable once it's dry. Once it's cured, it's not sandable. It takes a long time to dry, and it doesn't adhere that well. It's just generally not a very good primer. So stick to Stenolrez or some type of can primer if you're not going to. If all you have access to is Vallejo, it's really not good. For brush priming, primer tends to level out very well on its own, so you don't need to worry too much about, at least if you're using Stenolrez or something similar, it tends to level out very well, so you don't need to worry too much about clogging details. Personally, I literally will just kind of schmutz it on fairly thick, and then once you have it applied, you can go in and make sure there's no bubbles, and you just kind of dab your brush at it. You can dab your brush on a paper towel in order to take the primer that you have on there off, like so. And that way, if you have any areas where the primer is really pooling, you can kind of touch the brush to it and it'll suck up some of that paint. And then you can wipe it off on the paper towel again. And yeah, other than that, it's really just a matter of saturating the model with primer and then letting it dry. And it's really that simple. There's not much complication to it at all. How much primer should you put on enough so the paint sticks well, or change the color into a solid layer? I don't know if he's trying to answer the question while asking it, or what.
I was just about to mention that. So one thing that I've seen a lot of people do is when they brush prime, they'll brush prime like 5 layers so that they get this opaque black. You don't need to do that.
Yeah, one layer is perfectly fine.
Yeah, 1 layer is enough. You just need something covering the plastic so that your acrylic paint has something nice to bite into.
Yeah. So, as I was saying earlier, when you prime, you can actually see how good of a job you did with cleanup. So if I get in closer here, you can see there's normally a mold line along the hood here, and it goes down along the side and down the cloak there. And you can see we did a pretty good job of cleaning it up, at least sufficient by my standards. And if you're not happy with your cleanup, like on the back of the blade here, there's still a little bit of a mold line. If I wanted to clean that up, if you're using a primer that is sandable, which most can-based primers are sandable, Stenores is sandable, MIG One Shot is sandable, Ultimate Primer is sandable. And if you have primer that is sandable, you can take your sanding sponge or sandpaper or even a diamond file, although I would recommend against using that, or your knife, and you can just sand it. And it's really very simple, and this is an easy method for making sure that your model is nice and clean before you go to paint it. Because, like I said, it's important that you have a nice, clean, mold line-free model before you really get into painting. Yeah, the Citadel spray can primer is it's a good primer. It's kind of expensive, but it is good. So, need to wait a little bit longer for the primer to dry. Let me hook up my hair dryer. So while we wait for the paint primer to dry, let's talk about brushes. There are lots of different types of brushes out there. The ones that most people will recommend using for what we do is Kolinsky Sable brushes. We typically, as miniature painters, work with fairly thin paint, and so using Kolinsky Sable is a good option because they're very soft hair brushes, so it helps with brush strokes and things like that, and getting even layers and whatnot is a lot easier when you're using a nice, soft haired brush. They are also much longer lasting than something like synthetic brushes, which most cheaper brushes out there that you can buy are synthetic, not natural hair. These are natural, actual animal hair. Don't Ask asks how long should you wait or let primer cure or dry? I've seen people saying to leave it for 2+ hours. That really depends on the primer you're using. So Stenores, you really don't have to wait long. As long as it's dry, which takes, maybe 5 to 10 minutes, then you can start painting and you can even sand it. Some primers will only let you sand them after they dry to the touch using wet sanding, which is when you use water in conjunction with sandpaper. But Steno-Res is generally pretty good about, it's dry to the touch, you can sand it, and you can paint on it. So as soon as this is dry, I'm going to start painting, and it's going to be fine. If you're using spray can primer, that stuff you usually have to wait, an hour or something, or even longer, until it's properly dry to the touch and it's not super tacky. With stuff like Vallejo, this is one of the reasons I don't recommend using Vallejo, you have to wait quite a long time. It can be an hour or 2 hours, and it takes a long time to dry to a point where it's not tacky anymore and you can paint on it. So back to brushes. So all of these brushes are, well, one of these is Raphael 8404. This is a good brand. Winsor & Newton Series 7 is a good brand, and we'll probably make a guide on this stuff at a later date rather than just this video. But basically almost any Kolinsky sable brush is going to be better than using synthetic brushes. The reason being, synthetic brushes are fine in some ways, but one of the things that they suffer from is when you're brushing with them and you're using them, we tend to bend the tip a lot, right? So with synthetic brushes, when you bend the tip, over time they'll eventually take a permanent set. So they will be permanently curled at the tip, and that's a problem. You don't want a permanent bend. You want a brush that is going to stay nice and sharp like this for a very long time, ideally. One thing that I need to talk about whenever you get any kind of brush, really, but especially if you're going to use Kolinsky sable brushes or any natural hair brushes, getting this stuff is really important. Mine's fairly old, so you can't really see the brand, but it's Masters Brush Cleaner and Preserver. And this is basically a brush cleaner and also hair conditioner type stuff. It's a type of soap and conditioner, and it will basically clean as well as condition your brushes, and it keeps things in basically better working order. And it's really important to use this stuff when you're using natural hair bristle brushes. So using it is pretty simple. You just wet your brush and then kind of make strokes in the soap with the brush. I kind of twist the brush as I drag it through, just to make sure that all the bristles are getting nice and saturated with the soap.
Yeah, you really don't have to push hard when you're doing this. I see a lot of people kind of bending the brush to a 90-degree angle and really dragging it through. Just
Right.
get it damp and work up a nice lather. It's gentle. It's like washing your hair. You don't go in there and like annihilate it, you just work it through.
And you can see when you get a lather, because you can see the soap there, and that's all you really need to do when you're doing this. And then just dip it in the water again. What I like to do is kind of roll the brush back and forth gently in my palm, like this, and that'll kind of work the back of the bristles near the ferrule. You can see I have paint back here. That's, even if you try very hard to keep paint out of the ferrule, it'll typically get there one way or another.
Actually, yeah.
And
Got
so
some questions.
doing this helps. Do I keep my brushes in protective sleeves? No, not typically. If it's a brush that I actively use, I don't. But there's nothing wrong with using the protective sleeve. The protective sleeves being these caps. Like I said, if I'm not using the brush, like I have a lot of brushes in excess that I bought, so that I always have brushes on hand, I always leave the caps on those. And anytime I have them in a case like this is a brush case, I leave the caps on. But typically, if it's a brush that I'm using, it means that I'm going to have it laying on my desk like this, and you don't really need the protective case necessarily if you're careful. If you're going to have like a bunch of stuff near it that's going to possibly damage your bristles, then yeah, you should leave the cap on.
Or if you're about to make a bunch of dust.
Yeah. How often do you apply that product on the brushes? Doing it every time you finish painting is good practice. Using clean water instead of your paint water is ideal, so doing it at the sink or something is a good way to do it. But yeah, every time you paint is a good way to go about it.
Yeah, your brushes will love you for it. They'll last a lot longer.
Yeah.
Acrylic paint drying on the bristles, bad scene.
Yeah, and this applies to even synthetic brushes and any kind of brush with any kind of material hair is you should be cleaning them that way as well. Vallejo white minis have been sitting for a day and are still tacky. So if you're priming certain type of models, will only take certain types of primer. So Reaper Bones, for example, primers that are, I think, acetone based. So lacquers and stuff like that, stuff that's in a spray can, typically doesn't work well on Reaper Bones, and the primer will just never fully dry. Other things that can cause that is if you have oils on the model, stuff like that underneath the primer that's stuck on the model, your finger grease, things like that. It can prevent the primer from fully adhering to the model, and so it will always stay slightly tacky. If that's the case, really the only thing you can do is try and let it dry for a couple days. If it doesn't dry and it stays tacky, you're basically just going to have to strip it and reprime it usually.
I'll say too, the Vallejo primer in general doesn't feel, to me at least, like as smooth and, I don't want to say dry, but almost dry as anything else. Like it always feels a little rubbery because it's a very rubbery primer in the end. It's got a lot of like kind of elasticity to it.
Yeah, that's one of the things that Vallejo primer is technically more durable in the long run because of that. But it's kind of a double-edged blade because while the surface is more durable, the adherence to the model is less durable because it doesn't adhere to plastic and resin very well. So it'll actually peel off. Yeah. So more on brushes. These you can see various different sizes and types of brushes here. All of these on the left are just a standard pointed round. You can see something I want to just point out real quick is you can see this brush is not sharp. Something people will often run into is they will buy a new Kolinsky Sable brush and they'll get the brush and it'll look like this and they'll be like, oh no, I got sent a bad brush. But all it is that it's not wet. When you wet the brush, it will come back to, well, maybe this one won't. Let's see. Whenever you wet the brush, it'll come back to a fine point. And if the brush isn't wet, it's normal for them to fray like that. So these are various different sizes. Again, this is a Raphael 8404. This is a size 1 brush. This is a Winsor & Newton Series 7 2.0. So it's 2 zeros. It's one of the smaller brushes they sell. This is a size 1 Winsor & Newton Series 7. And this is a size 2. So with brush sizes, you really don't need to be using a 2.0, which is a common mistake beginners make, is they just go for the smallest brush they can buy because they think, oh, miniatures, so obviously I should buy a miniature brush. That's not really the case. Miniature brushes like this are useful still for painting things like eyes or really fine detail, fine lines, things like the teeth on this goblin and the little ropes. Using a fine brush like this can make that a little bit easier. But generally using a size 1 or a size 2 is really a very good, just all-around brush size to use for doing stuff like this. Are these the regular Series 7 or Series 7 miniature? So here is a example of what the difference is between the Series 7 miniature and regular. This is a Series 7 miniature on the right, and this is a size 3. This is a Series 7 regular, a size 2. And you can see, even though the Series 7 miniature is larger, it actually has much shorter bristles than the Series 7 regular. Basically what the miniature line is what's called a spotter brush. They're just very short bristled brushes that are basically they're going to be a little stiffer because they don't have as long bristles. Pushing them around is not going to be as easy. So if you want to do things like stippling and stuff like that, using a brush like this is a bit better in my opinion, because the bristles are going to stay put more. Whereas if you use something like this and you're trying to stipple, pushing on it, it'll bend a lot more when you use it, and that's generally not ideal. So it's just different applications. Generally, I and most everyone else would recommend just using the regular series. The Series 7 miniature is good, though. It's not something that you should avoid like the plague, as some people will make you believe.
You've just got to want it for what it is. It's not going to be the regular painting brush. It's got its own, eccentricities, but like Red says, it's got many very interesting uses. And yeah, if I feel like maybe then it's not super suitable for beginners who are just trying to figure out how to use brushes in general, but at some point you'll want to explore it. It's another cool tool. There's tons of them out there.
Yeah, I mean, with anything, I think you should try it yourself before you dismiss it.
Yep.
People say not to use them, and there's not really a lot of good reason to not use them, in my opinion. They're perfectly good brushes. It's just kind of a slightly different use case is all.
And even the most common complaint I hear about them is, well, they're so short, they dry out so fast, and like, well, that can be the case, but if you realize that limitation, you learn how to work with that tool to adjust for that, and you're not, you don't paint for as long with it. You reload it more, maybe you work a little wetter. There's, it's not just always going to be dry faster.
Yep. So this is a wet palette. We'll just talk about it briefly. You can make your own wet palette very easily just using paper towels like this here, and you just use paper towel, and this material on top is parchment paper. You can buy that at your local grocery stores like this. This is Reynolds brand parchment paper, and it's literally just a thin paper that is kind of water resistant, basically. You don't want wax coated stuff is the main thing, but generally it's something you kind of have to figure out what works for you from a local perspective. If you're in Europe, Reynolds brand parchment paper isn't really available, so you need to figure out what a good parchment paper brand local to you is. But generally, you load whatever is underneath with water. This is a sponge. Like I said, you can use paper towel, fold it up, make kind of a thick layer of paper towel, and then fill it with water, and then you just put paper over top of it, the parchment paper. And what this is going to do is water will permeate the surface of this paper slightly, and it'll keep your paints wet for a very long time, at least longer than using a dry palette like a tile or a piece of whatever. How much water? It really depends on your climate, honestly. Typically, I will fill it with so much water that the paper is kind of floating almost. That just works best for me, but some people will put less water in it. I don't have a lot of water in here right now. You can see it's kind of just damp inside. That works fine for some people as well, but if you live in a more dry climate or somewhere that's cold, water tends to evaporate a bit faster, or not cold, but hotter. Water tends to evaporate a bit faster, so using more water is better in that case.
Yeah, or if you've got an air conditioner running or a fan on the room, you're going to want it wetter because your evaporation rate's also going to be higher.
Yeah, that's a good point too. What color should we use to paint this?
Yeah, you still have to thin with a wet palette. It's not there to automatically thin your paints for you. It's just providing hydration to the paint because, acrylic paint dries by the water evaporating or whatever solvent evaporating out of it. In this place, you're constantly replenishing that solvent of water in it, so it dries a lot slower.
Right. So yeah, that's a very common misconception for sure, that wet palettes make it so you don't need to thin. The only time that's ever the case is when you have your lid on your palette. the paint will tend to get over thinned when the lid is on because the water in the paint is not evaporating as fast, and the water underneath it is still going into the paint. So when your lid is on, it'll tend to over thin it, like this right here is kind of over thinned because it's just been sitting in the palette with the lid on. But otherwise, it's not really something you need to worry about usually.
Yeah,
You still need to thin.
some paints from some companies are already so thin that, like, when they're on the wet palette, you're kind of good to go. But you know, it's still a thing that you just have to. You know, this is one of the biggest things you have to learn, right? Is what thin paint feels like for you. What's the right consistency? People can show you over and over, but it's one of those things that just clicks. So you kind of suss out which paints need how much water on your wet palette and this and that.
Yeah. So we're gonna get into painting here. I'm just gonna show a very basic approach to painting for beginners that is going to get you a generally pretty decent looking miniature without a lot of effort and with a more kind of structured approach, I would say. One of the issues with learning is that you often don't really know how to approach painting a miniature, and so you watch a bunch of videos and people teach you all sorts of different ways of going about it, and it can get really complicated and you're not really sure how to actually approach things still, even though you've just watched a bunch of videos and stuff. So what I want to show is just a very basic, like super easy to follow approach and rule to painting and getting a good basic looking paint job. And what you learn from doing this is kind of applicable to even larger or more advanced levels of painting. It's just once you get more advanced, you just kind of change things up a little bit in terms of your approach and everything. So I'm going to put a new paper on here real quick.
One thing to note too is that if you are working with colors and mixes on your wet palette that you want to continue to be able to use the next day, you can leave your lid slightly ajar so that your palette's not completely sealed, and that usually does a good enough job of mitigating the overhydration that all of your stuff isn't just a super runny mess the next time that you go back to it.
Yeah. Mystical Noodles, how can you tell? What are you referring to specifically?
I think that was the paint thinning question, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay. So I'm just gonna paint red. I'm gonna paint the cloak on this dude. Obviously he's not finished assembling, but I'm just gonna demonstrate the method that I want to show, so I'm not really worried about the model being complete. I'm gonna use 3 different colors of red and a wash, and that's it. That's all I'm gonna use in this process. Essentially what we're gonna do is we're gonna base coat. I'm going to show you how to base coat a model. Then we're going to apply a wash. Then we're going to reapply the base coat. Then we're going to highlight, and then we're going to do one final small highlight on top of that. And the reason that you do all these different steps is because when you're painting a miniature, one of the most important things that virtually everyone struggles with early on is getting contrast. You'll hear it all the time, contrast, contrast, contrast. People will always say, hey, you need more contrast on your mini, right? To the point where it's basically a meme at this point. And the reason that is, that people do that is because contrast is very important when you're painting a miniature. We're painting very small little characters who, if you just base coated a primary color or a base color and leave it that way, it's just going to look like that color because the miniature is so small. Natural shadows and light don't really affect it as much, at least not in a way that is as realistic, So because the model is so small, using exaggerated shadows and lighting helps things stand out more and look a little more detailed and interesting and nice. So gonna use this wash. So, I'm just going to paint the back of the model here. This is the side that we brush primed. And I'm going to run over a couple of things about painting. So the first step is always base coating. No matter how you go about painting, no matter what your method is, you're always going to base coat. There's a couple different ways of base coating, but the most simplistic and common way of base coating is to just use whatever color, generally a mid-tone of your color that you're going to use. So I'm going to paint this red. So what we have here is we have a crimson red. This is a kind of mid-tone red, which means it's not really dark, but it's not really light. Whereas this is Pyrrole red. This is more of a light red, and then this is vermilion, which is more orangish red. It's brighter than Pyrrole. It's brighter than our base coat, but it's still like within the realm of what we want. So this is going to be the final highlight. This is the first highlight. This is the base coat, and what we have here is a red shade, red tone from Army Painter. Any kind of wash is a good choice here. Citadel or Army Painter washes are what most people will recommend, and we're just going to use a red wash here because we're painting red. You don't have to use a red wash. You can use green wash, purple wash. There's lots of different things that you can do to mix things up and make it interesting. Colaire says, so you're putting the wash on the wet palette, wouldn't it leak through the paper? Certain types of paper that you use for wet palettes, the washes and inks will leak through the paper, but because I'm using parchment paper, that's not the case. When you're using parchment paper, it's pretty impermeable to paint, so it's not going to leak through really. And if it does, it's going to take days or weeks, not minutes. If you're using something like Masterson Stay Wet paper or the Redgrass Games wet palette paper or stuff like that, then yeah, washes will tend to leak through the paper and into the sponge.
Yes, Chaco, this will be uploaded to the YouTube.
Yeah.
We'll post the link again at the end.
Yep. It'll also be pinned in the general channel within 2 days after this recording. Alright, so for base coating, first of all, I primed black. You can prime a lot of different colors, gray, white. It's really up to a couple different factors. One, personal preference. I always prime black even if I'm using light colors. But a lot of people will prime gray or white if they're using light colors, or if you're using colors that don't cover very well. Red technically is a color that does not cover that well, generally. It depends on the paint brand, it depends on what's in the red paint, but typically red does not cover that well, so using a gray or white will be a little bit easier to base coat the model. But personally I always go with black, the reason being with black primer, if you miss a little area, it's not going to show up that well because it's black, and you can also kind of just work it into the process. Whereas if you're using white primer and you say base coat this and then apply a wash and you missed a little part of primer and you didn't cover it with your base coat, then that white will show up way more than black would. So that's one of the reasons I always use black primer. But it's really up to you. So I'm going to basically take a little bit of this base coat red that I'm going to use, and I'm going to thin it just with a brush load of water. So what that means is literally dip your brush in the water, as you can see here, and it's got water on it, and I'm going to put it in the paint, and I'm going to mix it, and that's pretty much it. Ratios and stuff like that are something that it kind of works okay in the beginning, but it's really something you need to get away from as soon as possible, because ratios are really not a good way to go about learning how to paint miniatures. It'll give you a good like basic starting point for where you need to start from in terms of thinning and things like that, but it's really important to just learn about the consistency that you need and such. So when making because we're going to base coat here, when making a base coat consistency, you essentially want the paint to flow reasonably well off of your brush.
Okay, background.
Okay. and not be like super crazy, um, super crazy thick or anything like that. So if I take, for example, one of these other colors straight out of the tube, these are tube paints, but it's just applicable to any kind of paint, and I apply it, it tends to be kind of thick, and when you're doing thin lines and stuff, you can see I don't get much flow off of the bristles. So I'll make these brush strokes, and sometimes I'll get lines and sometimes I won't. Whereas with the thinned version, I'm going to get a nice thin solid line every time I make a brush stroke, basically. And that's kind of a good way to go about figuring out what you need to be doing. I Am Me asks, do you use ratios for mixing colors though, so you can replicate it later? If you're painting an army, or you're painting something where you're going to paint more of that thing later, and you need it to be the same color, then yes, you should absolutely use ratios, and in that case it's very important. But in terms of just painting regularly, it's really important to learn the consistency and what it looks like and how it should behave, rather than relying on, 50-50 water to paint or whatever. Like I said, ratios are an okay starting point. So when I'm thinning this, I generally thin for base coats about 50-50 water to paint. But like I said, that varies based on what brand you're using, what color you're using. There's so many variables that it's really not, you shouldn't be relying on ratios. How are the Citadel base coat brushes in your opinion? I rather like the wedge brush they provide, though I have only been painting Battletech miniatures, which myself are a series of flat surfaces. I wouldn't recommend Citadel brushes ever, because they're just expensive usually. You can buy synthetic brushes, or any kind of brush in any kind of shape from normal art companies and stuff. So if you want like a good base coating brush like that, you can buy, this is called a filbert brush. This is a very large one, but filbert brushes they're not flat on the end, but they're kind of rounded, and stuff like this can be good for base coating large flat surfaces. But generally I don't really believe personally in buying a brush just for base coating. If you want a brush that's good for base coating and pretty much everything, then using a larger brush like this can be a good option. This is just a size 2 Winsor & Newton Series 7 pointed round, and generally you're going to be using the brush like this, not like this. So you're going to be brushing perpendicular to the length of the bristles rather than with the length of the bristles. So using a flat brush, in my opinion, is not necessary, but it can be helpful. Yeah, Jabby, if you want to read the questions out loud, you can.
I'm back too.
Oh, welcome back. Okay, so I'm going to base coat this model using this mixture here, and I'm just adding a little bit more water in here and there just to make sure that it's nice and thin, because this is one of the most important things about painting miniatures, is you don't want to go too thick when you apply anything, layers, base coats, anything. You want things reasonably thin, so that you're not obscuring a lot of detail and stuff when you apply your base coats and whatnot. So I'm just going to apply this on everything real quick. And the other thing is, don't worry about covering the miniature with one layer. Painting miniatures, or rather base coating, tends to take multiple layers to get a nice solid coat, and as opposed to what we were doing with priming and what we said about priming, where you don't really need a solid coat of primer, with base coating you generally should have a solid coat of primer, not primer, but whatever color you're base coating with, because this is what's going to be visible in the end, is your base coat and everything you build on top of that. So it's really important to have a nice solid base coat to work off of.
Yeah, this is one of those core fundamental building blocks that everyone should take the time to really feel like they have down super solidly, understand inside and out. I see a lot of people that are trying to jump ahead to more advanced techniques early on, and you can look at their work and see that the base coating is not even, completely nice and opaque, and from there it's sort of like, well, go back and do this because the rest of it's built upon this, so if this isn't good, you're not going to get a good end result.
Right.
If you have a hair dryer, an extra one even, very, very useful tool to have at your painting desk, especially with acrylics. It just can really speed the process up in a big way. Obviously, be careful. You don't want to actually overheat anything or melt the model. So.
Yep. Yeah, a hair dryer is something that I think a lot of people, for some reason, don't have, but should definitely have for painting, because it just speeds things up a long time. If I didn't use a hair dryer there, I would be waiting probably 5 to 10 minutes for this one layer to dry. You can get a lot more done on your miniatures if you're using a hair dryer to dry things between layers. So that was one layer, so I'm literally just going to apply the same color again, just over all the same surface, because we want to get a reasonably opaque base coat so that we can move on to the next step. And when you overfill the miniature with paint, something that you can keep in mind, just like what I said with the primer, if you clean your brush out on a paper towel like I'm doing over here, and then you go back to the model, you can actually pick up some of the paint that you applied. So if you do apply too much paint, you can easily just kind of suck some of it up with the brush, so that you don't, so that you don't overload your brush with too much paint. And then back to the hair dryer. Alright, so we're getting more opaque now. Actually, I'm gonna switch to a different paint, because this probably wasn't a good choice for this demonstration.
To do the Joso. I mean, that's the thing to make a note of too, right? Is that a lot of the miniature paints that we'll use, specifically like Citadel and Viejo and some of the other ones, are formulated for opacity, whereas traditionally acrylics, the benefit of them is that they have a lower opacity, so that you can, take advantage of that translucent property. It helps with blending, it helps with all kinds of things.
Yeah.
So that's why some people buy artist paint and go, hey, why isn't this covering? Well, it's not going to, because the pigments aren't opaque, and you can't make them opaque.
Right.
You can mix in other paints to change that. But
And if you are using colors like Josanja, one of the things you can do to improve the opacity is to apply a similar base coat color underneath, but one that covers better. So what I'm using here is Scale 75 Blood Red, Deep Red, and this covers very well. So I can literally, if I want to, apply this underneath, build just like a one-layer base coat, and then I can go over with the color that I was using before and get a faster kind of base coat over top of this. The same thing applies with colors like white and yellow. A lot of people run into issues with light colors like that because they're trying to go from, you know, black primer straight to yellow, straight to bright yellow, and that doesn't work because you're going from a very extreme value change. You're going from bright to as dark as possible, and yellow doesn't cover that well to begin with, so what you end up with is just streaky, ugly nonsense, basically. And so yeah, applying a color similar or close-ish. So with yellow you can use like a mid-brown. With red you can use a darker red like this. Darker red tends to cover a bit better. You can also use, again, you can use something like a mid-brown, or you can apply gray or something like that. Something that's a little bit easier to cover than black, but it really depends on what paints you're using and how your approach is.
Yeah, and as you paint more too, you'll definitely learn that certain pigment, like families of pigments, just don't cover as well as others. You get used to dealing with them.
Right. So let's get into the actual method we're going to do here. So I base coated the model with this deep red color now, and I'm going to now apply a red wash from Army Painter, and I'm just going to apply it to the whole surface. And the reason we're doing this is going to help us with the contrast. It's not a quiet hair dryer without the rope. It's just I muted, so you didn't hear it. With washes, you literally just apply them over the entire surface, basically, and that's basically all you do. Then you just let them dry, and then you can paint over them. When you apply washes, one thing you don't want to do is let them pool too much. So if I get really heavy areas where there's a lot of wash, I generally will go in and try to brush some of that out. Again, using the same method earlier, where you wick your brush on a paper towel or something like I'm doing over here, and then reapply it to the area where the pooling is happening, and it'll suck up some of that paint, so you don't get a too thick of a pool, which can obstruct detail or cause other issues and whatnot. And then I'm going to hair dry it again.
If you're gonna hair dry a wash, you want to be careful that you get the hair dryer a little bit away, because it can be really easy to push it into places that you may not want it to go. So you want to be more gentle with it and not directly in one area. Like you can see Red sweeping it back and forth so that he's not just shoving anything around. No, I mean, paint is consumable. You use it up, you know. You need to wipe some off onto the paper towel, because otherwise you're going to flood the model with paint and it's not going to turn out well.
Yeah.
You want to have just the right amount of paint so that your stroke is nice and even, leaving just the right amount behind and not flooding and running off all over the model.
Yeah, and most of what you're seeing on my paper towel here, this is just, it's just water, basically. The amount of paint in this is not really a big thing. It's not something you need to worry about, really. So we've got the wash applied now. It's reasonably dry. There's a little bit of wetness in there, but that's fine. So now what we're going to do is, I've applied a base coat, I've applied a wash. The wash is for shading, the base coat is just for your general color. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to reapply the base coat, but I'm going to thin it down a bit first. So I'm going to take the base coat on my brush, I'm going to make a separate pile over here. And this is just the base coat straight out of the bottle. And I'm going to take, again, a brush load of paint, or a brush load of water rather, and I'm just going to mix it in. And you can, the thing with this technique or this method is you can use these steps in varying opacities to get smoother or less smooth results. So if you want to do a quick dirty paint job on, say, an army model that you're trying to paint quickly, then using less thinned paint will still allow you to do layering, which is what we're doing. We're doing layering, that's what this technique is called. But it'll go faster because you won't need as many layers of each color that you use, but you'll get a less smooth result in the end. So what I have here is about 2 brush loads of water, and you can kind of see on my skin here how thin it is. And that's a common way for painters to test opacity of paints. If you can wear gloves if you have reactions with the paint and stuff like that, if you're allergic to things in the paint and stuff like that, you can wear gloves and just test it on the back of your glove, that's fine.
Getting paint in the ferrule is quite bad. It's a good way to kill a brush, so you want to be careful when you're loading a brush. I generally recommend for beginners, don't use your main painting brush to mix paint, to add water to it. Use a cheaper, older brush for those steps, because that's a lot of the time that's where you're most likely to get some paint into the ferrule by accident, and save that nicer brush for actually just painting on the model.
Yeah. And so when you're loading your brush for painting, and loading your brush is one of the more, it's another thing that beginners really fall into that they don't understand fully, and you end up with troublesome issues because of the way you load your brush or because of how much paint you have on your brush. Generally, you should just basically apply the tip of the brush in the paint so that you just have color in the end of the brush like this. You don't want to load the entire brush. You don't need to, run it through the whole paint puddle, just on the tip of the brush. And then another thing is you can wipe the brush on a paper towel. A wet paper towel helps a lot because it'll kind of shape the tip into a point as well. And that'll take some of the paint off of the brush. And the reason you do that is if you have too much on the brush, like if I load this up a lot like this is too much paint on the brush. So if this is very thin, like let me just thin this out real quick. This happens a lot when you're doing glazing and stuff. If you have a bunch of paint on your brush and you apply it to the surface, you're not going to be able to, stick to just very high points, and fine areas. You're just going to end up getting it everywhere. So you need to wick it off so that you only have a little bit, so that the brush is not overloaded with paint. That way when you apply the layers you're trying to apply, the paint just goes where your brush is going. So it's much easier to control what you're doing when you're doing that. When you wick the paint off on onto a paper towel before you apply it. But if you're applying just enough paint in the brush to begin with, you don't really need to worry about that. It's just you need to keep that in mind to make sure that you're not overloading your brush. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to, like I said, reapply the base color. And what I want to be conscientious of when I'm doing this is basically just only applying the base coat color back to the model on the raised areas of the model. So, you have all these little inner folds and crevices here in the cloak and whatnot, and where the rope is, and you want to avoid reapplying color inside those areas. So you just want to apply it to the areas that are outside of those, that are flat, or the peaks of folds and things like that. The reason being that we're trying to leave the wash that we applied inside of the recesses. That way, once we get to the highlights and everything, we'll have a much more strong contrast, because the wash is still visible in some areas, and that will contrast well with the brighter colors that we're going to apply at a later time. So I'm just going to apply it carefully to all the raised folds and such, like I said, trying to avoid the recesses and crevices and stuff where the paint has pooled from the wash, and just pick out all the little raised sections. And at this stage, it can be kind of hard to tell how much you're actually doing because we're working up step by step. So one of the downsides of layering is that when you do this, you can't always see what your end result is going to be as you do it, because each step is kind of subtle and hard to tell what actually is happening. But as we work up higher and higher, you'll start to see things come into view, and you'll start to tell, like, oh, here's what we're doing. This is why we're doing this. Okay. So I've basically applied my base coat again here. You can see only to the raised areas, again leaving the washes in the recesses. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to take that same base color, I'm going to set it off to the side here, and I'm going to take some of a mid-tone color. I'm going to, in this case, mix both of these colors together because it'll be a little bit more opaque and better for what we're doing. And then I'm going to actually mix it with the base color. That way you get an intermediary color, and intermediary is just basically in between the two colors. So rather than going up from dark red straight to bright red, we're going and getting kind of a red in between those two colors. And that's really important because you don't want to go crazy and jump up too high of a color. Like I said earlier, if you do that, you end up with brush strokes, you end up with spotty coverage, and it just doesn't look quite as good as it could if you were a little bit more subtle with each application of color and kind of mixed a bit more. So once I mix that, I'm going to clean my brush, and then I'm going to do the same exact thing. I'm going to take that color that we just mixed, and I'm going to apply it only to raised areas of the model. Now, as we're getting into this step, one of the things you want to keep in mind now is with layering, which is what we're doing, each step of color you apply, you want to kind of apply less color than you did before and cover less of the surface. So whereas before with the base coat color, I applied it over every raised area, just leaving it out of the recesses. Now with this color, I want to kind of apply it only to the raised areas, but kind of decrease the amount of surface area that I'm covering so that I'm not covering the previous layer completely. You still want it to show through in some areas, basically. So I'm going to apply it same as before, but just covering less surface area overall.
Yeah, sort of nesting it in that previous round of highlights.
Right. And the reason this is important is because with layering, what you're basically trying to do is build kind of a gradient between your dark colors and your light colors. So as I apply these colors, because we're decreasing the amount of coverage with each step, once we get to the final highlights, we'll have more of a strong gradient of color shifting from dark to light. If you don't do that, or if you use too opaque of paint and you don't thin it down well enough, then once you get to your bright color, what you'll see is steps, essentially. You'll see each step that you applied, and you'll see a hard line between each step from your dark color to your light color, and it won't blend in as well. And that's something that we generally like to avoid, because it gives you a better looking miniature if you have a bit more of a subtle transition as opposed to just hard steps from dark to light. And of course that's kind of a stylistic thing as well, and you may like the look of more, or I should say less blended paint jobs, and if that's the case, then that's fine. That's a stylistic thing, and not everyone likes the same style of paint jobs, so it's really up to you. But generally, a good rule of thumb is to at least learn blending, learn how to get reasonably smooth looks, and then, once you start getting into your own stuff and you start kind of building your own style and whatnot, you can kind of start to break that rule and get more painterly and whatnot.
Yeah, regardless of what you like in the end, it's always good to get these core tools in your toolkit and understand them and
Yeah,
practice them quite a bit.
right. So,
Gives you a good framework to experiment on.
right. So now I'm going to take my bright color again, and I'm going to mix more of it. At this point, if you think of it in terms of ratios, again, everybody needs to get away from ratios, but um, just as a basic kind of rule, what we're doing is basically taking one paint, two paint. We're going to mix number two paint in with number one paint in roughly 75 to 25%. So 75% of the base color to 25% of the lighter color. And then we're going to reverse that when we do our next layer, our brighter layer. So now I'm using more of the bright color and almost no of the dark color, almost none of the dark color. And then just like before, I'm going to apply this, and I only want to pick out, again, just covering less surface area than we covered before. So I'm just applying it on the brighter areas, the more raised areas, the tops of folds, things that are higher to the top of the model, stuff like that. Because we're, again, trying to build that gradient up. And we build that gradient by covering less and less surface area with each brighter color. Non-metallic metal it's
I would say it's at the latter end of beginner goals. Like,
yeah.
you could start thinking about it, but really, these basic processes, like we're looking at here, of like layering. So I don't think it's something we're covering today, but glazing. You know, like the core actual techniques that you hear about that are more of like the physical application of the paint. You really need to have those under your belt. I think non-metallic metal also, you really need to start thinking about and working on your skills of observation. It's not something that you're going to follow a recipe for at all. Um, One of the most crucial parts of it is understanding the placement of light and the reflectivity of metal. So if NMM's a goal of yours, look into old Renaissance art when they first started painting non-metallic metal. Look at pictures of metallic objects. Look at them in the world. Like, take something that's metal and go hold it under a lamp and move it around and watch the way the light comes off it and think about what that's going to translate to in terms of values on a model. You know, like what's bright, what's dark. But definitely feel confident painting without it first. You know, that's something you add later once you really feel confident with the basics and even intermediary skills of miniature painting. I think that if you don't follow that and you don't like take the time to work up to it, it's easy to get really bad results and get really turned off from it. So I would say really make sure that you feel pretty mastered of the basics and some of the mid-range skills. You know.
Yeah. It's definitely important to learn the basics before you worry about doing more complicated stuff. If you're the type of person who likes to throw yourself in the deep end, and you're not going to get discouraged from trying non-metallic metal, you know, then, I mean, in my opinion, go for it. But it's not going to look good in the beginning. You're not going to get to a point where non-metallic metal looks good when you're just starting out. Everybody really just needs to learn the fundamentals at the start, and then once you get that stuff down, you can start going a little crazier. So next, this is a very straightforward process. Each step, we're just going to be taking a brighter color, mixing it a little bit with our previous color until we get to a point where that color is covered enough, and then we're going to go to just that color. So now I'm going to use just my mid-red here, and I'm going to thin this down a bit, just so that it covers reasonably well, but it flows is the main thing. You want it to be able to flow off the brush as you apply it, like so. So then I'm going to just, again, same as before, just apply this over the areas that I want brighter, and covering less area than we covered in the previous step. just kind of making brush strokes here, covering the tops folds, stuff like that, same as before, covering less surface area overall than the previous step. If anybody has any questions, feel free to ask now.
Any questions? Time for questions. Question time.
Okay, so we applied that layer, and you can start to see now that we're kind of getting a contrast. We're reaching a point where the recesses are darker than the bright points, the raised areas, the tops of folds, stuff like that, along the top of the shoulder, along the bottom of the cloak here, on his arm, each of the folds on his little dress bit, the top of the hood that he's got on. You're starting to see that contrast take shape, and that's really what we're doing with stuff like this, or with this method, is trying to get that contrast. And like I said earlier, that is essentially one of the most, if not the most important aspect of painting miniatures, is getting a decent contrast.
Yeah, it's critique that you'll hear through all, you know, levels of skill of mini painting, from basic beginners to the people that are winning, you know, crystal brush or whatever. Like, contrast. That's one of those huge things that you have to think about and work on always.
Yeah. So now I've taken my vermilion color. This is kind of an orangish bright red, and I'm mixing it with my previous color, which is just the red, and I'm going to apply that color now. And same as before, we're going to apply it on less surface area than prior, just decreasing the amount we're covering so that we get that gradient effect going on. We get more of a strong contrast from our dark colors to our light colors as we go up.
What's your question, Jappy? Save that for another time.
So now I've applied that, and we're starting to get to the finish line here. So now I'm going to apply just the vermilion color on its own, no mixes at all. How often do you change your water? If you're painting with just normal paint, then every session or two, I would say, is a good way to go about it. Because leaving your paint just sitting in the water like that, your water can get really nasty and gross, and it can actually have health, like, effects on your health in some cases.
I think there's other concerns too, like obviously if you're going to switch from using metallic paints to non-metallic paints, change your water, rinse your brushes.
Yeah, or just have a separate water basin for metallic paints is also a good way to go about it.
If you're going to paint with super light, like, colors like white or yellow, it's kind of nice to have clean water to use for thinning them rather than kind of the murky pop that you may end up with painting with a lot of other colors if you want to keep them nice and clean looking.
Right.
On the obverse, I kind of like having my paint water from that session be around, because then you're kind of mixing the colors that you've been using on the model into all the other colors. Can help bring things together a little bit, but it's, you know, don't leave it sitting out for days. That's gross.
So I'm applying, this is basically the final highlight color now. And when you're applying the final highlight on your miniature, it's good to just cover like just the very finest points of your areas. You no longer want to cover much surface area, just whatever would be the brightest of your model or your object that you're painting. That's where you should be applying this color. So I've applied this, as you can see, hopefully, just to the very bottom of the dress, just the very peaks of all the folds along the bottom of the dress, just along the very top of the shoulder here, and you know, just on the cusp of the hood and the very peak of the fold underneath the hood. You just want to hit like those very bright points and not anything else. And another thing you can keep in mind with this stuff is if you apply a layer and you feel like it didn't do much or it didn't do enough, you can apply the layer again. So I'll just apply this layer again, and this time I'm going to cover even less surface area than before with the same color, and this will just like kind of help pick out things even better than before. Just apply some up here.
Chappie wants to know if you'll go over edge highlighting.
Yeah, I can go over edge highlighting. So that's pretty much this method in a nutshell. You start with a base coat, apply a wash that's going to add shadow, reapply the base coat thin down, then apply a mixture of your base coat plus a mid-tone color, or a base coat plus a highlight color, and then apply only the highlight color, then apply a brighter highlight color mixed with the highlight color, and then just the highlight color. And building up that way will give you a nice, oh god, where's the frame? Will give you a reasonably decent gradient, and you'll get a nice contrast. And as we said before, that's something that people struggle with above almost anything else when they're beginners. Even once they get to the intermediate levels, people are always struggling to get good contrast, and this is an easy way to go about it if you're a beginner, is just layering and working from dark to light, basically.
Letting that wash do the heavy lifting.
Yeah, the wash is really, it's not something you have to use, but for beginners it's really easy to use. We're working with 3D objects here, so they have all the detail you need. It's just a matter of filling out that detail in a way that is appealing at the end. And washes help you fill out the recessed areas very easily. You just apply a wash, let it dry, and boom, you have a shadow color. Then it's just a matter of picking out the higher areas, which is a bit more complicated. So edge highlighting, we'll go over edge highlighting. Let me grab a yellow color.
I have red to see it. I'm going to have to take off here.
Okay, see you later. So edge highlighting is a kind of different method of highlighting. It's something you see GW do a lot in their videos, and a lot of people who paint Space Marines and whatnot do that a lot. It's a good thing to learn, of course, just like any other technique. It's an important thing to understand how to use, but it's not something you have to use everywhere. It gives a certain type of effect, and on certain objects, like on this blade, if you're painting a weapon or something, then highlighting the edge of the weapon in certain areas can make the edge pop out better from the rest of it. Or if you're doing armor panels, highlighting just the very edge of the armor panel can make things look a little better, make it stand out a bit more, stuff like that. In terms of color selection, what colors should you use when you're doing edge highlights? It depends obviously entirely on what colors your base color is. So if I'm using red, as I'm doing here, edge highlight colors typically should be a brighter red. But if you're getting to the point where I am, where you're using something like vermilion, which is basically borderline orange, you don't want to go brighter than that, because there is no brighter red. So the only other option really is to mix in another color. What I'm going to do here is use yellow. This is just a mid-tone yellow color, and I will use this mixed with my brightest highlight color that I used, the vermilion, and I'll use this to edge highlight. If you're using colors like green, purple, blue, yellow, stuff like that, you can usually just mix in white with your highlight color, a little bit of white, and that will give you a nice bright highlight to use on your edges. But if you're using colors like red, where if you mix white in with red, it just makes pink, and if you don't want a pink edge highlight, then all you can do really is use an orange or mix yellow in, things like that, because you can't just mix white in, otherwise you get pink. So for edge highlighting, there's a couple different ways of going about it. One of the ways is using what's called side brushing sometimes. It's when you use the body of the brush up here rather than the tip of the brush. So if you want to do that, it's really simple. You're going to touch the edge of your model against the side of your bristles, like so. So we're going to essentially just carefully kind of brush over the very edges with the side of the bristles instead of the ends of the bristles. And that will give us a kind of peak highlight. And this only really works if you have sharp edges. So if I apply it here, you can see it a little bit easier, hopefully. Whenever you have a really sharp edge, like so, you can pick it out with that side brushing, which is literally just applying it like this, using the side of the brush, and it'll pick out those sharp edge points. But if you don't have those sharp edges, then the only way to go about it is to use the tip of the brush like we do when we're painting normally. So in order to do that, it's really important to have a nice sharp bristled brush. And another factor is to make sure your paint is thin enough that when you apply it, it flows off the bristles. Like I said earlier, if you're applying thick paint and you brush it on, it tends to kind of be spotty. You don't get really good flow off of the bristles. You get kind of just chunky streaks, and you don't want that when you're doing edge highlighting. You need flow in the paint. So I'm just going to mix this up a little bit more. I'm going to mix some water in it to make it nice and thin. Not too thin because I want it to be opaque, because the fact that it's an edge highlight is you want it to cover fairly quickly. And then we're just going to hold the model as steady as possible. I'm going to brace against the model, and then I'm just going to use the tip, just the very tip of my brush, and just paint the very ends of the object. So I made a mistake there. Just the very ends of the objects, and if you make a mistake, you can go in with your previous highlight color and kind of blend it out again by just reapplying it in that area. It's fairly simple. So I'll do it here on this edge of this cloak as well, and just kind of cover the very edge. And something that you want to avoid when doing edge highlighting, in my opinion at least, is you don't want to highlight every single edge on the model. That's something that some people do with Space Marines and stuff, and what you end up with is something that looks like it came out of Tron rather than a miniature. It's a different look. Maybe you like it. If you like it, more power to you, but generally you shouldn't cover the entire edge, just cover some of the edges, and that'll make things stand out better. How important is using retarder while doing layering or blending? It is kind of a personal preference thing. Again, it comes down to somewhat your climate where you live. If you live in a place that is really dry, or you have an air conditioner on in your room all the time, then yeah, using retarder can help slow things down a little bit so that you're able to work with the paint a bit longer. With wet blending, which is a different thing that I'm not covering here because it's more of an advanced technique, using retarder can be really, really helpful because it slows the paint down enough that you have working time to blend it. And that's pretty universal. If you're wet blending, you're going to want some retarder, usually. So yeah, that's pretty much it. You can see here we just have like a decent contrast from dark to light, and that's layering. It's just starting with a mid-tone or a dark tone, applying a wash, and then working up from there to brighter and brighter colors. You can see we applied the edge highlights along the bottom of the cloak here and along this little hood, and that kind of helps pick out some of the details and stuff. So yeah, I mean, this is a very simple, direct way to make a nice looking paint job without a lot of complication, without a lot of theory, without a lot of anything else. Just straightforward base coat, wash, base coat, mid-tone, highlight. And yeah, it's that simple. So if anybody has any more questions, now's the time to ask, because we're pretty much done at this point. Yeah, retarder can help with smaller brushes. Some people like to use bigger brushes, like Sinistus says. I still use my smaller brushes all the time, and when I'm doing that, I just use a little bit of retarder to keep the paint wet longer. Because when you have a smaller brush, there's less surface area for the paint to fill. So less paint means it's going to dry faster. So if you have a very little brush with very little paint on it, the paint is going to dry faster on the brush. Should the base coat be a lot darker than the mid-tone you put on? It depends. So generally, yes, it should be reasonably darker. You can see the colors that I'm using here. This is my base coat that I used this time. And this is reasonably darker than the mid-tone that I used, which is this color here. And you can see that there's a distinct difference between those. That's really important. You do want a distinct difference between each of your steps. If you don't, then you're not going to have much contrast. Do you need special medium or thinner, or is water fine? Water is universal. Water is always fine. You don't need any additives of any kind ever, almost ever, for just painting standard. There are lots of pro painters who paint exclusively using water, and it's perfectly fine. What mediums do, though, is it gives you different options. And so mediums are things that you should try. Buy small bottles of them if you can. Try them out, see if you like them, see what they do for you. There's lots of different types of mediums and additives, thinners, flow aid, things like that, and all of them have different properties and different benefits. So it's really something that you need to try out and practice. Too much water breaks the pigment's bond, though. If you're thinning down to a glaze, it can, yes, but again, it's the issue that happens with that is when you thin a paint too much on your palette or something, you can end up getting separation. So the paint will sit there, and when you have so much water, the paint will actually separate from the water, and so you'll have to remix it. It can also change the durability of the paint. If you have more water in your paint and less medium in your paint, the medium is what gives paint its durability, what gives acrylic paint at least its durability, because the medium is an acrylic resin that essentially hardens when the water evaporates out of it. And so if you mix more water into it, there's essentially less of that acrylic resin per drop of pigment and water. So the more water, the less durable, but if you're gonna varnish your models at the end anyways, it doesn't usually really matter. And most model paints like Vallejo Model Color, Scale 75, Citadel, most of this paint has enough medium in it that they're durable even if you thin them down quite a bit. So it's really not something you should need to worry about much. If your paint is breaking on your palette when you mix water into it, just mix it up again. You can use matte medium and add that to the paint, and it'll help bind it a little bit better, but it'll also make the paint thicker again. And thicker paint means more brush strokes, more spottiness, more issues like that. More obscuration of detail as well. Alright. Any other questions before we call it a day? It's looking like no. Alright, well, thank you everybody for showing up then. These have both been recorded, both mine and Nan's streams have been recorded. I will try to edit them either tonight or tomorrow and get them uploaded. Let me post a link in the voice chat channel to the YouTube channel where they'll be uploaded. They will also be pinned in the general chat within the next 2 days, so if you check there, it will be available soon. And here is the channel where they will be uploaded to, so if you want to subscribe to that or bookmark it or whatever, they'll be uploaded there within the next 2 days. So thanks for checking it out. I'll post a picture of the miniature that we painted to the voice chat so that you can reference it if you want to use it as a guide for your own work. And yeah, we'll be doing more of these in the future. We're going to be working on guides and stuff like that. We maybe do a buying guide soon. I want to do an airbrush guide that I've been working on. I want to get that finished. We may talk about doing the kit bash stream that was mentioned earlier. That's a good idea. Someone said a basing stream. That's also a good idea. So yeah, keep an eye out on the announcements channel, and we will announce any of that stuff that we do in the future before we get to that point. What to use for decals. Alright, let me stop the recording.